Okay, so welcome to this Ask Me Anything session here at the Discovery stage. And we have Brian and Filip here to talk and answer some of the questions that happened during the day. Of course, you can join if you happen to have any questions. You can use Slido, as we have used through the conference, or you can also raise your hand, and I'll ignore you. Now I'm gonna take your questions, and yeah, we'll find out if we know an answer for that. So you want to do a little intro?
Sure.
Cool. Filip,
Am I on?
I think we have a trouble with the microphone.
I don't know. No. Okay. Hey, my name is Filip. I'm a developer advocate for Flutter at Google in California. And I was giving a talk with Brian about Rx, practical Rx in Flutter. And yeah, that's about it. Or, I don't know if you need it.
Oh, no, it's a good one. Yeah, and my name is Brian Egan. I'm an independent developer living in Berlin right now. And I work on Rx Dart, which is the reactive extensions for Dart. And so, yeah, our talk was kind of combining Flutter from Google and some of these reactive extensions types of things together. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you for that. So let's take the first question. How does Flutter with RxDart compare to React Native with RxJS or Redux Observable? Why not use one code base for both, also for a smartphone app, or either both of them?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah. Go for it.
So the differentiating factor of Flutter, as I said in the talk, is that Flutter compiles to like native code, and by native I mean actual machine instructions, so ARM code, which means that we're trying to enable really kind of smooth AOT compiled apps that are very custom. The other thing is it's not just compiled to native ARM code, it has direct access to OpenGL. So like you can do anything. You don't need to build the UI using the native widgets. You actually can't. You have to do everything, or Flutter does everything from scratch. And this is enabling the kinds of apps that we are seeing at the top of the lists in App Store and Play Store, where no longer do you get these like cookie cutter apps, and it's that you have these very, very branded experiences. Like for example, if you look at like the Uber app on the App Store doesn't look like an iOS app, it looks like an Uber app. And it's very similar to the same app on the Play Store, right? You have the physics are a little different, there are maybe a little different fonts, but like the main UI is like it's Uber and not something else, right? That is similar to what happened to the web. If you think about the web like 15 years ago, if you came to a web page and there was a button there, the button was actually rendered by the system, right? So it was like a Mac OS button on Mac OS, and it was a Windows button on Windows. Today, if you go to a website, you almost never see that. You always see a very custom branded button that is like, that's like the website's button. So we see that and we want to enable that. And so like React Native is a different story, right? It still uses the platform views, and it has a bridge and like, a JIT compiler and all that. And that's something that enables a different experience, which is also really great. And but it's something else than what we are trying to do.
Yeah, and I think the second part of the question might have to do with code sharing, right? You're asking, well, now you're going to write like your web app in JavaScript, and you're going to write your mobile app in Flutter, and like now you've got two code bases to manage. And actually, that's not quite true. And so what you can do is you can actually use layering, right? And so what you can do is you can treat Flutter as a view layer, and you can use other libraries as well. So like Angular Dart, there's an Angular package for Dart. And what you can do is you can write all of your common business logic and all of your database access, these types of things, you can enable or work with all of these and kind of put them in their own layers, right? So you might have your business logic layer and your data layer. And then basically when you want to share that code, it becomes really easy because it's all pure Dart. So you can actually end up getting really high code sharing between an Angular Dart or an Angular web application if you don't want to use Angular Dart. And you can actually share, I think, somewhere between 50 and 65% of code between those two applications from real-world examples, according to the AdWords team and another company called AppTree, who do exactly this technique. So yeah, so you shouldn't think that if you go with Flutter, you can't reuse code. You totally can.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, I want to underline that this is not like a theoretical thing. This is actually what like the AdWords app, which is the main like source of income for Google, is built with. So they have a they have a website or web app, and they have iOS and Android apps, and they're sharing code through RX.
Yep. I think that gives a really nice developer experience overall.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. What is the most popular Flutter app built by Google, in your opinion?
So if we're talking about popularity in terms of numbers, right now that's the AdWords app. Like that's millions of people who are kind of trying to give us money. So we're kind of excited about that. There are I kind of understand that this is not like the kind of sexiest kind of app that is out there. It's really important for Google, and I'm glad that this is exactly the kind of apps that we're building, because yeah, I mean that kind of gives you an idea of how important that is for Google. That said, we have a pipeline of apps that are in Flutter that will be released later, and that are in the more like sexy kind of part, but not yet.
Okay, all good. Let's see if we have one question here from the audience, now that we had a little bit of conversation. No? Okay, I'll take the next question. How much of a code base can you share between iOS and Android in Flutter?
Yeah, so once again, I think what we've seen from real-world large-scale applications, from AdWords to other companies like AppTree, who are doing this exact pattern. Like I said, it depends on the approach they take, but the reports have been between 50 and 65%. Of course,
I think you're talking about iOS, Android, and web.
Oh, iOS and Android. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I totally misunderstood that. Then at that point, AppTree said about 95% of their code. So they probably have a very custom UI, and once again, this is what is really nice about Flutter. And so, you know, you could think about like showing an iOS button on the iOS platform and like an Android material style button on the Android platform. But because I think they use a fairly custom UI, they've said that they've been able to share 90 to 95% of their code. So yeah, so you're going to be able to reuse a majority of your code between iOS and Android as well.
That really comes from again, from the architectural choice of Flutter, of like owning every pixel, and so therefore, like if you want an app that looks exactly the same for iOS and Android, and just the things like scrolling behavior and you know, like fonts obviously are different, then that's 100%, because you really don't like do anything else, right? And so many apps that you'll see, like sample apps from you or like from us, will just be that one thing, and there's no like if else anywhere, except very deep in the framework.
Yeah, and I'd also like to quickly note as well, if like there are Android developers in the room, you might know like how difficult it is to support older versions of Android as well. And this is actually one area where Flutter really shines. So if you put a button on screen, it will look the same on all platforms. So you might not have this like really weird experience on 4.x where you're like missing drop shadows and like certain animations aren't working, or having to spend a lot of time getting those things working for older versions of Android, which are still very popular in developing countries as well.
Right. Sorry, I just want to, because nobody's asking about this as far as I know. There's also a downside to this, right? So we have basically a canvas, and you're like bleeding right onto the canvas, OpenGL on Vulkan. That means that it's basically, like, you cannot use native views, right? So if you have a library somewhere with like a button that you like for Android, you cannot use that because you'll have to recreate that. What we see is that it's actually pretty easy to recreate that in Flutter, but like if you really depend on that, then you're screwed with Flutter. So Flutter again is very much geared to the very custom experiences, and it doesn't, if you know. For example, if I had that kind of problem of using many native views, I wouldn't recommend Flutter at all.
I was thinking of a question of my own, and I was thinking in a lot of the scenarios we can see that keeping with the new versions of Android, and for some providers, phone providers, there's some delay when they can actually release on the new phones. And how is that in your experience on iOS? Because I also remember that iOS sometimes can be a little bit not so open. I mean, on the side of Android, I can see that could be smooth going forward, but maybe iOS will put some, kind of roadblocks, or maybe won't make it that easy.
Right. So yes. So for example, I like to start with like the backwards compatibility, right? So because we if you use Flutter, you own all the pixels, and we give you kind of material design, all that stuff. You can actually have like a material design app on a phone that came out way before there was material design, like in 2012, and that's again because of the architecture. That doesn't mean that again you might not want that. You might want for some reason to keep the old style, but again, if you have a custom design, you probably don't want to, and you want things to look similar everywhere. For the second part of the question about iOS, then we've seen that it's again whatever you ship is going to be that's going to be your party. Like you're not asking iOS please render this button. And then on platform apps, that would mean oh, I'm actually a newer version of iOS, so I will render this kind of button. This is something else. And in this case, Flutter will just render the button that it ships with, and that again is if you're trying to build an app that looks really kind of cookie cutter like iOS, then that's going to be always the same until you update the app. Which I think is a strong point, but again, if it's only for the apps that are custom built.
I get it now. So you take charge of this, and then moving forward, you can be assured that that won't be affected by any of the
yes.
Future updates, which is kind of strong. And also going backwards, I mean that's awesome.
Yeah, but obviously that doesn't solve the issue of if for example if iOS comes with a notch, right? Or they did, so you have a notch. Now you have to deal with a notch, and what we've seen, we were actually prepared for the notch before the notch came out, because it's something that thankfully Apple tells people about, and then they release the Xcode and all these things that enable it for iOS development. But you can prepare, again, if you own the whole canvas, you can prepare for that before. So we have, for example, we have a widget called Safe Area, which is you just put a safe area somewhere, and it knows that if there's a notch, it will be below the notch, so you know that this area will be readable, for example, and it's not going to be covered.
Understood. Okay, so let's take another question. Is it possible to use? Okay, that was a big change. Okay, let's take this new one. What kind of app performance can we expect from Flutter compared to React Native, for example, or others, if you have numbers? Or...
I mean, you got to benchmark everything. Flutter's just faster. Don't worry about it. Don't compare it. No, I mean, with everything, I think so. You have some interesting advantages with Flutter, where you actually, like for example, at SoundCloud, we had a React Native app, and one thing that you generally suffer is from like a startup time, right? You have to start up the VM, your phone has to interpret the code, and this is something even Airbnb talked about in their series about removing React Native from their apps. So this is an interesting thing because, like I said, you're involving a JavaScript interpreter. And one nice thing is because Flutter, when you're in development mode, it actually uses an interpreter and a just-in-time compiler. But as Filip was saying, when you're ready to go to production mode, it will compile that down to native machine code. So what I've seen is I've seen much faster startup times on the app I've built. And as far as building really custom animations, like it's just really smooth and really fast. And now, of course, these are optimized OpenGL instructions, and so sometimes if you've got a phone that has maybe a less common GPU, for example, you might see some really bad performance. But that's a really good test case to just submit a bug and let the Flutter team know, like, hey, for some reason on my 1+6 or something, I'm getting really bad animations here, and then they can optimize. So. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, like I said, it's always really hard to perform or to think about performance between two things without having a really good, fair test case. But I would say, overall, I've been impressed by the speed of Flutter as a user, essentially. And for me, as a subjective, I've felt it's faster than React Native, but yeah, measure first, then talk, so yeah.
Actually, well, thanks for the answer. I was thinking about, because it's quite a new approach on this, area. What are the reactions from native developers when they experience, Flutter, and what are their feedback? What is the feedback from, both maybe iOS developers and Android developers?
Yeah, I think there's definitely skepticism because we've seen all these if you say cross-platform development, that's like everyone's just running away. And that's because oftentimes the cross-platformness and the developer experience kind of came first, and then the user experience was like, yeah, well, they'll deal with that. And so I think what's new about Flutter, and that's why we always talk about the kind of the compilation to machine code, is that you can have, and if you have something like this that compiles both JIT and AOT, you can have a good developer experience with like a hot reload and all this, but you can also have a really good user experience because it's fast, right? You can definitely, to come to the next, previous question, you can have a shitty Flutter app that's slow, that's no problem. But it's kind of, we try to make it really hard, and yeah.
Well, I was recently talking with some people from the Flutter team. It was at ReactiveConf London, and one of the things that they point to me is, the development cycle was like super fast, and that was one of the main wow. It was, you had the new version, you did a change, and then you could see what would be the change, on the app really, really fast.
Yeah.
Is that something that who is more happy about this? iOS developers or
everyone?
Android developers?
Because both iOS and Android they take a long time to compile, and so stateful hot reload. This is what you're talking about. You can be in any screen inside your app, and you can change something and just Control save, and it will reload in under 500 milliseconds. So that really changes the way you're building apps. But for example, we weren't talking about this in our talk because I think if you choose the development, your development environment just because of a development experience, then it's just come on. So you're building apps for users.
Totally.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a shiny feature.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I basically bailed on Android as soon as I had hot reload again. So yeah, I mean, maybe just more of a subjective thing, but yeah, I kind of came from the web and design world. Then I moved into Android for 5 or so years, and when I found Flutter, I was like, oh yes, I get my fast hot reloads back, and You know, I think things like the demo we did today, like there's no way we could have done that on native Android. It would have been like, all right, so we're just gonna like wait for 2 minutes while this recompiles, you know? And for me, I think you like make a really good point, which is like you know, when I first tried Flutter, it was still, you know, you had some jank and like some of the animations weren't smooth, but like it was clear that it was going to get there from a developer experience, from a design and user experience, and then from a developer experience, it was such a breath of fresh air when you know, especially like I said, having a design background and wanting to make changes and like just add some drop shadows. And I know this sounds ridiculous, but sometimes this can be really difficult on Android. So I was super happy to jump into Flutter for sure. So yeah.
Yeah, I figured. Okay, so let's take some more questions here. What would be a JavaScript alternative to the switch map? I mean, this is completely.
Yeah. That's a good question. So you would have RxJS or Extreme. There are a few different Kefir, Bacon. There's like quite a few reactive like stream libraries for JavaScript. And almost all of them should have something like switch map. For sure, RxJS has switch map directly. And you might also see it named things like flat map latest, or it might have a slightly different name, but this is a really common operator, so you'll almost get it with most of those types of packages.
Cool.
Yep.
We get any questions from you?
Yeah,
cool.
I have a follow-up question on the developer experience. So we know that we have pretty cool hot reloading and all that stuff pretty fast. Compared to React Native Dev Toolkit, when we have the native, like the native debugger, where you can just see all the views and change the properties of them and see them in real time. But does Flutter have any toolkit like that, or what's the Dev Toolkit for Flutter developers?
So we have okay, so to repeat the question, I'm really bad at repeating questions, but it's like, how does Flutter tooling compare to React Native tooling? So Flutter has supports basically Flutter supports different ways of building your app, including just like, you know, editor like Vim and whatever. But like the most well supported is Visual Studio Code or IntelliJ, anything in IntelliJ. And in Visual Studio Code, I think it's a really good one. What I use, as you saw maybe today, I use IntelliJ or Android Studio, and which is the same thing. And we have Flutter Inspector, which I didn't show, but you basically can just like inspect everything. It's borrowing a lot from the web tooling, so you actually can like click on something on the screen and it will show you exactly what it is, and you can change things, and yeah.
And it's awesome. Actually, one of my favorite things about this as well is once you like select an element, you can even like double click on it and it'll take your editor straight to that part in your code as well. So especially if you're like coming onto an app, so I joined like a company that was building an app and I was helping them build it out as well. And I was just trying to get familiar with it, and so it was so cool. I could just like tap on this thing and then go directly to that part in my code base, so you're not like searching around like, all right, is this like search to screen.dart or anything, and you just like, you can really get to the code points you worry about really well. Yeah.
This is a similar question around this topic. So is it easy to configure Flutter into a Visual Code or WebStorm, or is really recommended another tool like Android Studio?
Yeah, it's funny. So yeah, it's definitely easy to. So in VS Code, you just go install packages and you like install Flutter, and it will do everything like in a few seconds.
It's called Dart code if you're interested in the package.
Well,
name,
I mean, so you can actually install Flutter, and it will automatically install Dart code for you.
It does that now.
Yeah,
oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I don't.
Learning
and
new things.
for Android Studio, I know that Android Studio and IntelliJ community, and you know that is the other one, the not community one, the enterprise or whatever they call it. That's definitely supported. WebStorm I actually use even for Flutter development, but I'm not sure how much that's supported, because I know that the IntelliJ, different versions of the IntelliJ IDEs, even though it seems like they should be like super compatible, sometimes they're not. So you can try it and you'll probably be fine. But like if you want to have that like, you know, if you want to be sure, go with either VS Code or Android Studio or IntelliJ.
community edition.
Community or the
Yeah,
one
or Ultimate,
that's not,
yeah.
So you will get all the setup like really
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah, and I actually think it might not work in WebStorm anymore because that used to be my primary editor, and I think they have some weird restrictions on Java. I don't know. It's like IntelliJ, they try to push you towards their ultimate product, so I think they've not removed that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see the next question. Can we expect any kind of roadblocks similar to what we were talking before from Apple if we want to release Flutter apps to the App Store?
Right.
So there's any...
Yeah, I can't talk, for Apple, but one way to think about it is, well, first of all, the app that I showed today, like the screenshot with the Reflective app, was actually featured on the App Store, so that tells you something. It's not like they look at this and they, oh no, it's Flutter, but we're not going to feature it. So there's definitely many apps today, like Hamilton app and stuff like this, that's on the App Store, and they have like millions of downloads. So that's great. One way to think about this is basically Flutter is like Unity, but for apps, right? So that it's the same model. Like you're shipping binaries. So to me, it's almost like if Apple says Flutter is verboten, then they have to say Unity is verboten, and that I don't think that's going to happen. But again, I'm not an Apple spokesperson, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, we'll take the last question and then we can wrap up. So how about device sensors? Do all of them run smoothly with all Android and iOS versions, or there's any small differences when using Flutter?
Yeah, so probably similar to React Native. Essentially, you build these plugins that talk to the native platforms and send the data back. And so usually what you would do is you would wrap up the platform differences a lot of times in kind of a common API. So if you're working with geolocation or microphones or cameras and things like that, you generally have a single interface and it'll work for both platforms. I think this is I'm not here just to totally say Flutter's awesome. I do think this is one area where Flutter could use some improvement actually I think there's a few different plugins for geolocation, but when I used it, I had to go in and modify the Android code, and God forbid I did some iOS as well, but and so I think this is there's for the most part a really good story for a lot of these, but it's still, because Flutter is in beta or I guess release candidate, there's still I think some of these packages could be a little more refined over time.
Yeah, we do have a package ecosystem that has all these plugins, and so we're actually now, because we're approaching 1.0, we're trying to own some of these plugins so that we know that these are, at least GPS and Bluetooth and stuff like this is actually, good quality. And obviously if you have something super custom and you don't find a plugin that is already existing, then there's this whole plugin architecture where you basically you can write it yourself like you did.
Sounds great. Well, thanks a lot for coming here to the Discovery stage, to this Ask Me Anything session. They will be available for the couple of hours that maybe stay here. Otherwise, I guess that you can use also Slido, and we will make the questions reach them. So thanks again for joining the AMA, and that's all. Thank you.
Thanks for hosting us.